Hola, y bienvenidos. Hello and welcome. Mi nombre es Emiliano y junto con mi compañera Andrea voy a proveer interpretación del inglés al español y viceversa. My name is Emiliano and along with my coworker Andrea, we will be providing interpretation from English to Spanish and vice versa. This is to ensure language justice so that everyone can speak and listen to the meeting in their language of preference. Esto es para asegurar la justicia lingüística, que todos pueden hablar y escuchar en su idioma de preferencia. So, in order to achieve this, we're going to want people to select interpretation if they are not bilingual. And you can do that by clicking on the globe at the bottom of the Zoom application. If you don't see the globe, you may need to click on the three dots that say More. From More, you'll find the word interpretation. There will be many options, so you'll have to look for interpretation. And you choose your language of preference, and you confirm it. Entonces, para lograr esto, si no son bilingües, deberían escoger la interpretación. Lo encuentran como un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Si no ven el globo, van a apretar el botón de More o más opciones, que son 3 puntos. Y de ahí buscar interpretación entre las opciones que salen y escoger su idioma y confirmarlo. And we want to remind our panelists to please speak slowly. Remember that Spanish typically requires more words to convey the same meaning, and especially if you're reading from a text today, to read it slowly. Queremos recordar a nuestros ponentes que hablen lentamente. El español requiere muchas veces más palabras para decir la misma cosa, especialmente cuando están leyendo de un texto. Por favor, de leerlo de forma lenta. And so if you've been able to click on interpretation, thank you. If you're having trouble finding it, please let us know. Entonces, gracias si escogieron su interpretación. Si tienen dificultad en encontrarlo, por favor, informarnos.
Okay. Well, thank you, Emiliano. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. I'm Bob Lee. I'm co-editor of the People's Tribune newspaper. The People's Tribune and our bilingual sister publication, the Tribune del Pueblo, are part of the Zooming to the Resistance Coalition, which is an informal group of independent journalists, activists, artists, and researchers that came together out of some meetings we had back in 2019 and 2020. The coalition in 2020 sponsored a series of 5 webinars, which we called Zooming to the Border at that time, where we brought together panels of people who were active along the southern border around immigration issues and other issues of concern to the border communities. We looked on this as a kind of people-to-people fact-finding mission regarding violations of human rights along the border. And we compiled the information gathered from those discussions into a 64-page report, which we submitted to various public officials and which we also posted online. Last year, we decided to again start doing webinars about immigration issues in light of the wholesale assault on the human and constitutional rights of immigrants and on everyone's rights that has escalated tremendously since Trump took office in 2025. And this webinar today is a continuation of an effort to help people be informed and active in defending human rights and challenging the growth of dictatorship in our country. And of course, we're not the first and we're not the only ones to be doing this sort of thing. We're just hoping that by giving people a platform to speak, we add some small contribution to what millions of other people have been doing for many years. I wanted to also take a moment to note the passing of Magdaleno Leno Rose-Avila, who was a member of our coalition. Leno always made an important contribution to the thinking and understanding of our group, and his activism represented an important contribution to humanity. He passed away recently in Seattle, and I wanted to just quote a few sentences from a message that his family sent out shortly after he died. Leno was a human rights activist, a published poet and writer, and spent his lifetime working to help others in need and to make our world a better place. In 1968, he participated in the protests at the University of Colorado around the death of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The protests led to many changes on campus, including the development of the first program for minorities as well as co-ed dorms. Leno served as Peace Corps country director in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Paraguay, and Micronesia. His past employment includes Amnesty International USA, the Cesar E. Chavez Foundation, Witness to Innocence, Death Penalty Focus, the Department of Labor, the Colorado Migrant Council, the Democratic National Committee, and numerous other positions with various organizations working for civil and human rights. Leno is survived by his wife, Carolyn Rose-Avila, who has also been part of our coalition, his son, Kimbo Tenorio, his daughter, Aviva Rose-Avila, and a large extended family. There are plans for several memorials in various cities, and those will be announced at a later date. And with that, I'd like us to observe a moment of silence for Leno before we begin the webinar. And at this point, Nancy is going to share her screen and show a short video about Leno, which includes some of his last words.
Every time you open up your heart and your minds to love, you take a risk. And that's what's kept me, you, and a lot of us working in behalf of human rights. Is that we know that when we open up our hearts, we can protect everyone. There's a lot of things someone will say, but it's most important that you understand that we all have a responsibility to hug somebody, love somebody, and to protect the rights of everybody, including those who hate us. Because we have people that hate us, but we don't hate them. And we're going to teach them about love, and we're going to change their hearts and minds. Sometimes people ask me, don't you just hate them? I say, I don't have room to hate. I hate what they do, but I don't hate them. I do love them because we can change the world, and that love is stronger than hate. So I want you to join us in this great movement of compassion and learn to give, forgive, and to be forgiven.
And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Pedro Rios, who's going to be our moderator.
What a beautiful tribute to Leno, Bob, and thank you, Francisco and Nancy, for putting the video together. I think the message of responsibility to protect one another, the message of love, should be front and center. And it reminds me of a message that one of the first Quakers stated many, many years ago, that love was the first motion. And with that, it reminds me that that's why we do the work that we do, and that's why we uphold each other to the responsibility of ensuring that dignity is protected. I want to begin by first thanking everyone, you, Bob, and Laura with Tribuno del Pueblo, the People's Tribune, the colleagues in Zooming to the Resistance, as well as our distinguished panelists, and to all the audience members joining us this evening from throughout the United States and different parts of the world, and of course our interpreters, who are an important part of making this conversation accessible to everyone attending today. So I'd want to ask you to feel free to share in the chat your name, organization if you belong to one, and the location from where you are joining us. It's always fun to see where people are chiming in from and where they're joining in. And also as a reminder, if at any point you have a question, we will have a Q&A session at the end. There's a button down below on the screen. you can see it says Q&A. Feel free to pose your question there, and then our colleague Joseph will be looking at those and compiling them to present them to our panelists later this evening. And to extend the introduction with which Bob began this webinar, as immigration raids have become front and center for many in our communities, beginning with Chief Greg Bovino's Border Patrol agents conducting indiscriminate raids targeting workers in Bakersfield and throughout Kern County. These raise questions, serious questions about what we can learn from the past to understand the present as well as the future. Border Patrol and ICE agents have acted as an occupying paramilitary force. It has become the template for immigration raids that were replicated around the country in Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, and led to the unfortunate death and killings of migrants, as well as allies responding to the enforcement actions. With statements that Border Czar Tom Homan made last week about increasing immigration raids, especially at municipalities and states who have the courage to confront these tendencies, we know these enforcement actions will likely not stop and that they will continue. We also have witnessed a general rejection of constitutional protections, and there's no viable recourse for holding agents accountable for their misconduct and abuses since oversight agencies have been depleted of resources or completely eliminated. This speaks to a greater existential question about how a society can move forward when its democratic principles are being challenged and where impunity usurps the rule of law. How can it continue to uphold basic protections for everyone? On this panel, we will explore these questions as well as those related to the evolution of recent immigration enforcement operations and the ideological and political underpinnings that sustain these government actions. I now have the honor of introducing our three accomplished panelists this evening, experts on issues of migration, borders, and constitutional rights who will address questions associated with the topic and the title of this webinar, a review of the expanding and unaccountable powers of the U.S. immigration enforcement system. So let me just read off a little bit of who our panelists are. Beginning with Dr. Marla Ramírez, who is a historian of the U.S.-Mexico border and assistant professor of history and Chicanx, Latinx studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Ramírez investigates how processes of mass immigration removals have imposed notions of illegality on citizens in their own native countries. Professor Ramírez is the author of Banished Citizens, a history of the Mexican-American women who endured repatriation. Our second panelist is independent journalist Todd Miller, who's the author of 4 books. He's based out of Tucson, Arizona. He's co-founder of The Border Chronicle, which I encourage you to sign up to and to follow. And his books include Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders, published by City Lights, and Empire of Borders, The Expansion of the U.S. Border Around the World, published by Verso. And finally, our third panelist, a friend of mine who I've known for many years, Camilo Perez Bustillo. He's a human rights activist, lawyer, scholar, and law professor who is a child of migrants from Colombia and the parent of migrants from Mexico. He is based in Mexico City as a founding member of the leadership collective of Witness at the Border, Testigos en la Frontera. His publications include books such as Human Rights, Hegemony and Utopia in Latin America, Poverty, Forced Migration and Resistance in Mexico and Colombia. And so welcome to the three of you. It's my pleasure to begin with our questions as we get along with this panel. And I'll begin with you, Marla. And so as I provided in the introduction, the immigration raids have led to significant cases of abusive practices by government officials, and where ICE has had a significant role in being a perpetrator of those abuses. based on your research on the history of the repatriation acts of the earlier part of the 20th century, what can you tell us about how this type of state violence is not new, and the frameworks and models for it exists in how Border Patrol and other immigration agencies conducted their operations in the 1930s?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's really an honor to be in community and to think together about our current moment. And thank you for that question, Pedro. My recently published book, Banished Citizens, documents the mass removals of mixed status families of Mexican origin during 1921 to 1944, right after the economic recession that followed World War I, and then throughout the Great Depression. And as we know, historically, during economic crisis or political instability, there's always a creation of a scapegoat. And that scapegoat happened to be ethnic Mexicans during the interwar period, 1921 to 1944. And as part of the so-called recovery plan, a proposal to deport all immigrants for the country was proposed by legislators at local levels and state and national levels. Eventually, it became a targeting of ethnic Mexicans, specifically mixed status families, as we refer to them today. Families that are composed of both Mexican immigrants, but also U.S. citizens and other people with different legal statuses. And the parallels that I see with the current moment today are worrisome. And I think we need to remind ourselves of the importance of understanding our history to be able to effectively navigate the present. So the question that you pose, Pedro, is how do we understand the current moment, thinking historically? And during the interwar period, not only immigrants were being removed in mass, but also U.S. citizens. So in my book, I question, or one of the central questions is what it means to be a citizen if you are ethnic or racial minority in this country. And we see that today as well, where that racial profiling is happening. The people who are out and about speaking Spanish or other language are suspected to be immigrants just because they're not speaking in English, or if they are darker skinned or essentially not white. The idea that whiteness is linked to citizenship was informing the removals in the past and also today in the present. The other thing that we should pay close attention to is not only the imaginary of undocumented status, right, that then overpasses due process, but also we need to be aware of the needs to protect people's rights, that immigrants in this country are protected under the Constitution. Anybody who is residing or visiting the United States are protected under our Constitution, right? But also that American citizens have also constitutional rights. But if we demonize a group so forcefully that we then excuse their legal, human, and civil protections, that can become a dangerous slippery slope that can affect not only immigrant families or mixed status families, but can affect the rights of women, can affect the rights of working class folks, can affect the rights of other people, regardless of the legal status. So in the past, we saw immigration officers having great discretion on who to remove and how to enforce those removals. They could remove people just because they assumed that somebody was an undocumented immigrant, and if they questioned them or arrested them and asked for proof of legal status and they could not provide that proof, then they didn't give them the benefit of the doubt or the time to reproduce their legal ability to remain in the country or have due process to see an immigration attorney or an immigration judge. And now we see that again in the present, right? Where due process, we continue to turn a blind eye to due process, and people are arrested first or deported first, and then questions are asked later. We need to be vigilant about demanding that those rights are protected, and denounce the tendency to turn a blind eye to those protections for both immigrants and citizens in mixed status families. And also in the past, in today, there hasn't been in the past or in the interwar period, there was not a change to immigration law or naturalization law to remove U.S. citizens in mixed status families. They were simply understood as economic dependents of the men of the household or the head of the household. So, in other words, U.S. citizen women and children were seen as removable if the head of the household was deemed as an immigrant likely to become a public charge. And so that was the echoes of conversion doctrine, right? That the idea that women belong with their husbands and children belong with their mothers, and as such, entire mixed status families should be removed together. Today, there hasn't been a specific large change in immigration or naturalization law, and yet in the ground, because ICE holds great discretion on how to enforce immigration law, even without a change in the law, we still see citizens in mixed status families and immigrants being removed without going to the appropriate channels, having the right to an attorney, having the right to an immigration judge, having protected due process. And so those are some of the more worrisome parallels that I see today that we need to be keenly aware of.
Thank you so much, Marla. And what it reminds me of, at least many of us who live in the greater Southwest have a story to tell about removals, repatriation of U.S. citizen family members. My paternal grandparents, born in Los Angeles, were removed in the 1930s. So very personal connection to these stories. Thank you. I want to continue with you, Todd. You've written about Border Patrol's unsettling expansion and its detrimental impact to people they encounter, especially to people who call the borderlands their home. From your research on the contemporary enforcement landscape, are you able to point to how ICE's enforcement tactics are a replication of Border Patrol's enforcement tactics that border communities have experienced for decades, and why should this concern everyone?
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. It's really great to be here, and it's an honor to be here in conversation with all of you. ICE has always been a sort of difficult agency to understand in its whole. I think back to an article, I think it was in 2009. It's called America's Secret Ice Castles, and by Jacqueline Stevens. And I mentioned that article because in that article, Stevens tracks the 200 to 250 detention centers that ICE has. And mind you, a quick one thing, 2009, that 6 years after ICE first came to be in 2003 with the formation of Department of Homeland Security. So the agency has not been around for that long. And then two, I remember the word detention. I struggle to say that sometimes because I remember I was interviewing an ICE official, and I used the term prison instead of detention. And he immediately corrected me and said, no, it's detention. And then I said, oh, people are free to come and go then. So it always, the whole the semantics of it always, throws me off. But anyhow, Stevens in her article looks at the 250 detention centers or prisons, if you want to call them that, or whatever word you want to use, and shows that these centers some of them are known about, but many of them were hidden. Right, there is a detention center underneath the High Line. I can't even remember what it's called, but it's this walkway in New York City, and that people would just, stroll and do their evening strolls right above a detention center, and that sort of omnipresence but hidden in plain sightness is often what I think of when I think of ICE. I remember reporting that I did over in 2012 or 2011, and it was with a family, and they were sleeping, and at 6 a.m. it was in Tucson, Arizona, where I live, and all of a sudden there was a bang on their door, and then the door came open. A bunch of turns out to be ICE agents, but one would never know because they weren't wearing uniforms, barged in to the house. They took the father. There was a family of four, two young kids, and they came and took the father, took him out and put him into a nondescript white van with no insignia, nothing on it, and took, in the kids' eyes, kidnapped their father. And they asked, why did these people just come in and kidnap my father? Um, and that to me describes this, like, omnipresence. They're all like everywhere, yet hidden aspect of ICE. So fast forward to now, we should say that ICE is, I think, still around 20,000 agents total. It's divided into two parts. One is called HSI, which is Homeland Security Investigations. That's a whole other thing we could talk about, but does a lot of international work. And ERO, which is Enforcement and Removal Operations, which is basically the deportation machine. That is what arrests and puts people in detention, in immigration prison, and then deports them. You fast forward to today, and to answer your question, Pedro, by looking at the sort of replica we're seeing of the border and the borderlands and the enforcement apparatus that we see on the borderlands, I mean, you can look no further than these operations that we've seen. Let's look at the Minneapolis one, Operation Metro Surge, I believe it was called. And as you referred to at the very beginning, Pedro, the Greg Bovino, the Border Patrol sector chief of El Centro, one of the most violent sectors, was the one in charge of that operation. So that operation, while in the general media often was given, it was ICE, people were talking about ICE. Um, and it was 3,000 agents, 2,000 agents were ICE, 1,000 agents were CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, mainly the U.S. Border Patrol. And then it was run by Bovino. So we have basically an extension of the border. And I'm using this one example. You can use a number of different examples like this, but the extension of a border enforcement apparatus that Bovino was doing in El Centro sector being extended, in this case, to Minneapolis. You could use Chicago. Chicago, for example, there was an instance of agents, Border Patrol and ICE, I believe at the same time, rappelling out of a helicopter into an apartment building and arresting people in this apartment building, going after people who weren't citizens, but also arresting everyone, I believe, in that particular apartment building. That rappelling is stuff that you see in Border Patrol recruiting videos, and that's the sort of stuff that you might see in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Or if you go further, right, when you think of Minneapolis, the extrajudicial killings that happened there, and that sort of impunity that we see in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands of the killings by the U.S. Border Patrol. And I immediately think of Raymond Matia, who is a Tonaotum man who was shot, I believe, 39 times by the U.S. Border Patrol in 2023 and killed on the spot when he came out of his house. And I believe he tossed his phone, or was reaching for his phone, or tossed his phone to the ground, and the U.S. Border Patrol unloaded, just started shooting. So that's sort of those sort of enforcement tactics, this sort of impunity, that we've been seeing. I mean, and those just couple examples that we've been seeing on the U.S.-Mexico border, that sort of authoritarian imposition then extends into Minneapolis, extends into Chicago. And as a last point of this, for a long time, we've been talking about the 100-mile zones, right? The 100-mile jurisdiction that the U.S. Border Patrol, they call them the like where the Constitution isn't quite the Constitution, supposedly. It was referred to as the Constitution-free zone at one point, but I think the ACLU doesn't like to call it that. But the whole idea of your rights being mangled, and it seems like that Constitution, that sort of Border Patrol jurisdiction, which covers 2/3 of the U.S. population, 200 million people, which has been a point of concern for many people. The extension of the border enforcement inland is now, I would say, what's concerning about now is that it's definitely extending much further than that without much debate at all about it. Like Minneapolis is 300 miles from the U.S.-Canada border, and I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Todd, and many of our colleagues and human rights defenders in other parts of the world talk a lot about the effects of border externalization. And so taking the practices and policies of what we've lived in border communities and extending them into other parts of the world. I think we can talk about border internalization when we're talking about Western countries such as the United States. And a colleague of mine, Andrea Guerrero, talks about the borderfication of urban centers as well. Very similar concept. And so, Camilo, from what Marla and Todd have shared, how do you see what has changed under this new enforcement landscape when it comes to constitutional protections? Under Trump 2.0 regime, why has it been possible for ICE and Border Patrol agents to get away with the countless Fourth Amendment rights violations that we see play out in these operations?
Thank you, Pedro, and everybody who's spoken so far. And just again, for me, the honor of participating in this dialogue. I want to apologize again for my voice since I'm recovering from fighting fascism, as Pedro suggested before, as we were assembling this group informally, and just what it means to do this work day in and day out. I think one thing is, I think it's important for us to zoom out, and I say this as somebody who's been doing this work for a long time. Pedro and I were doing it together at the border. I was based later during the first Trump administration in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez and Las Cruces. And that was during the crisis of family separation in particular. And now I'm looking at this from the other side of the border, from Mexico City, where I've continued to work with Witness at the Border and with the International Tribunal of Conscience. And I think what's helpful about looking at it from that perspective, and a lot of Todd's writing has been about this, and of course, all of the important work that Marla has done about documenting what it means when you have families deported under those kinds of circumstances. And what we've seen when, what Pedro alludes to about both the internalization and the externalization of these politics and these policies. I think it's what happens when the exceptional becomes normal. And I think as a human rights scholar, as a lawyer who's been doing this work for a long time, what I would underline is that, Walter Benjamin, the extraordinary German philosopher who wrote about a lot of this in a different context, but that's very connected, in the late 1930s. In fact, he wrote about this in 1940, as he was denied an entry visa from France into an exit visa from France into Spain, and an entry visa into Spain as somebody who'd been dispossessed of his German citizenship because of his Jewish ancestry and because he was politically persecuted, because he was somebody who was a communist, along with Hannah Arendt and Bertolt Brecht and others of his generation. What he wrote was, he said, the traditions of the oppressed remind us, teach us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. And that's really what US constitutional law has always been about from its origins, especially as we creep towards the 250th anniversary, and for many, celebration of that Constitution. When we think about what the 14th Amendment is supposed to mean, what's left of it after the last year and a half, when we think about what it's meant for people of African descent, for the formerly enslaved, what it's meant for indigenous peoples historically, at the same time that the Border Patrol was being created, US citizenship was being imposed as a mode of exclusion and denial of sovereignty to indigenous peoples at the exact same time in the mid-1920s. The Border Patrol, of course, was being created as an echo of the Texas Rangers, literally reproducing the modes of genocidal violence at the US-Mexico border that was the product of a war of aggression against Mexico and the dispossession of half of its territory. That's where US immigration and border policy comes from, of course, and where the story, the history that Madla's work so powerfully documents is all about. That's what US immigration and border policy has always been. And now that has all been unmasked on the streets of LA and of Minneapolis and of Chicago and Memphis and DC and beyond. And so I think, the only people who are surprised are those who haven't been victims of these policies or students of these policies. Now the border is everywhere, as many of us have been insisting for years, as the Chicano movement has been insisting for over 50 years or 60 from its origins, and the Mexican-American civil rights movement and generations before that. So none of this should really be surprising if we study the history. And what I think is striking, and Pedro just alluded to this, is those of us who know anything about the history of human rights in Latin America or elsewhere in the global South, suddenly terms like forced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, or even terms from the 1930s like concentration camps, which is what the detention centers where US citizens of Japanese origin were caged in the 1940s. They were called concentration camps by US government bureaucrats in the government of FDR. That's what all of this apparatus was already known as before the second Trump administration. So why should we be surprised? And why are we debating about whether or not it's fascism? Why is that somehow beyond the pale? So again, if we know our Constitution, if we know the 14th Amendment, if we know Korematsu, if we know all of this history, we should understand, and particularly we would insist from the perspective, for example, of Witness at the Border and of the International Tribunal of Conscience, that's what we're grappling with. We're grappling with crimes against humanity. We're grappling with concentration camps. We're grappling with crimes for which there has to be accountability before international tribunals and, for example, truth commissions. And there have to be individuals and government entities held responsible. And that's why we're asking you all to join us in holding these criminals responsible.
Thank you, Camilo. Very well said. And I want to remind the attendees, if you do have questions, please look at the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A button there. You can pose your questions there, and we will try to compile them and try to get to them when we're finished with the formal questions to our panelists. Todd, I want to go to you and to address a more contemporary situation. You attended the Border Security Expo last week, which is, in my opinion, the greatest evidence of collusion between the state apparatus and private businesses, where priorities are centered on profits and the bottom line versus the protections of rights of migrant communities, and for that matter, everyone else. What are some of the takeaways from that conference on the direction of current and future immigration enforcement trends? And what should we be concerned of?
Yeah, thanks. There's several takeaways from that conference. Just so people know, it's a conference, like you mentioned, Pedro. It brings in the high brass of Department of Homeland Security and CBP and ICE. So like Thomas Homan, the border czar, was a keynote speaker. Todd Lyon, the director of ICE. Rodney Scott, the CBP commissioner, they're all there speaking. And there was over 200 companies, private companies, that were present and also displayed their wares. So you get to kind of see a crystal ball into the future of what's being imagined with that sort of conversation between the officials and private companies before your eyes in the exhibition hall. So you see lots of surveillance cameras and biometric systems and drones and UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles. You name it, it's being imagined. Guns, like there's more and more gun sellers there. And it's so you get to witness this conversation between industry and, in this case, DHS, and this case Trump, the Trump version of DHS, right? So there were several things. The first and foremost is took a look at contracts this year, and for 2000, what year are we? 2026. Yeah, for 2026. And I was astonished to see that $25 billion in contracts have been given out by the Trump administration in 2026 to private companies, which is by far the record. The year is not even finished. And the record was last year at 15 billion, and the record before that was Joe Biden's 2023 at 9.8 billion. So that gives you an idea of this raising amounts of money being given to private contractors. And a lot of that I learned at the Border Security Expo was because of, one, the budgets for the border and immigration apparatus. Basically, if you take CBP and ICE budgets and put them together and go from 2003, when they those two agencies first existed with the DHS, and followed them, they go up every single year, religiously or without fail. But added to that, of course, is what they call OB3. That's what they call it, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right? Which $191 billion has gone into, additionally been put onto those budgets. And one of the officials said that they were front loading that. So that $191 billion that is mainly going to CBP and ICE has been front loaded. So she said in a panel that 75% of that would be spent by this September, which is the end of the fiscal year. So what they're trying to do is what she called bring the mission to speed. She used some sort of phrase like that, meaning that they're ramping things up. Things are being ramped up in major ways. And you can see it through the sort of privatization element, these contracts, You can see it in these operations that they're doing, and in a variety of ways. They are saying that that's what they're going to do. And what is it exactly they're going to do? Well, Pedro, you also mentioned at the very beginning what Thomas Homan said about going after sanctuary cities, right? Going after cities that are refusing to work with ICE. And what Thomas Homan said, the border czar again, he said that they were going to, instead of one ICE agent going into those places, they were now going to send 7 ICE agents, right? So it would be multiplied by 7. And then another really startling thing that was brought up was the redefinition of terrorism. And the redefinition of terrorism in terms of drug trafficking and what they call drug gangs, those two entities are now defined as quote unquote terrorists in the eyes of Department of Homeland Security. So the Maduro operation in Venezuela was Maduro was declared a terrorist, right? And so it was a terrorist operation. In the Border Security Expo, the DEA commissioner spoke, and he said, we came to remove that terrorist for injecting poison, he used the word poison, into our country, right? And so that whole idea, that externalization of the border, right, is now the bombing of boats coming off of Venezuela is another example. He said the axis of evil was China, Venezuela, and Mexico. Mexico being China providing the precursors for fentanyl, and then it coming from Mexico or from Venezuela. So the kind of hyperbole, I guess, or that sort of, but the definition of terrorism, what that does is unleashes all kinds of powers. It unleashes the Department of War. It unleashes all kinds of agencies and the use of the whole of government approach. And the last thing I wanted to say, and there's many takeaways, but I guess I'll just limit it to this last one, 3. And that was that the DEA person also mentioned that people coming into the United States, in other words, undocumented people crossing the border coming into the United States, he almost used the word infiltrator, like is often used in Israel, right? And then said that they didn't know who of the people crossing were terrorists under the broader definition of terrorism, and thus, not saying it explicitly in that moment, but then the Attorney General, Todd Blanche, was a speaker as well. He said it explicitly, well, we're going after all these people that are terrorists. We are happy that we're calling them terrorists. So I would say that a new kind of redefinition or upping of the global war on terror is being done before our eyes now with this Trump administration, and you're seeing it going through the border lens, right? The extension of what the border is into the interior, the internalization and the externalization.
Thank you, Todd. A lot there to take away. And as AFSC, we did have a couple of colleagues that were there as well at the conference, and they're preparing their reports as well to understand the possible implications of what this might look like or how it might influence enforcement measures moving forward. And as you referenced, the billions of dollars that have gone into enforcement, Camilo, I want to ask you, and we know that the U.S. hasn't reformed immigration laws since IRCA in 1986, yet they've dedicated these billions of dollars on the militarization of border communities and increasing boots on the ground. And just last year, as Todd referenced, the big, beautiful bill has $170 billion for immigration enforcement. Beyond the impact that this type of enforcement and its actions has had on civil rights and on constitutional protections, a broader question is how human rights are impacted by increasing the militarization of cities around the country. Human rights abuses are rampant in border communities. So what can you project could happen to human rights protections for people who live in non-border cities?
I think there are a couple of important layers here in terms of the the analysis of the relationship between constitutional rights, civil rights, and human rights. I think something that isn't sufficiently well understood, and I think that this is something where the work of AFSC has been really important, is to understand that essentially the way the constitutional framework functions or should be understood in practice is that international human rights standards are incorporated into the Constitution and should be understood as integral to constitutional and civil rights protections. So in effect, human rights become part, the international human rights framework becomes part of the US constitutional framework. For example, and this may seem like it's unrelated, but I think in fact it's a key example for those of us who look at human rights as being sort of a weave where each part affects the whole. Those of us who are concerned about the issue of Palestine or of Gaza, for example, and concerned about issues of genocide. And for example, those of us who think that immigration and migration policy is becoming increasingly genocidal as the number of people in detention increases and the number of deaths in detention and in custody increase, and as the conditions in detention deteriorate and more become equivalent to forms of torture, which itself is classified as a crime against humanity, right? So we understand that all of these different standards are interrelated. Well, one of the things about genocide is it's one of the foundational normative standards and principles in international human rights. And in 1988, the US Senate, at a time when there was a senator named Joe Biden, who was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, adopted the UN Genocide Convention as a treaty that became incorporated into US law. What that means is that genocide is not just a treaty out there in the land of the UN, let's say, that's kind of la land. It's something that's actually incorporated into US law. So when the US helps fund and support genocide in Gaza, it's actually violating US law. So there's kind of a bootstrapping principle to human rights. And what that means is when there's torture in a US immigration detention center, that also violates US law because the UN Torture Convention is also a treaty that has become incorporated into US law, and so on. What this also applies to is, for example, when those Venezuelan and Salvadoran migrants were put on those flights in March, a year and a half ago, and sent to that torture prison in El Salvador that was funded by US dollars, and where you had Kristi Noem prancing around in front of the cameras and the cages, that was an act of torture funded and subsidized by US law, which violates US law. And the conditions under which they were held were tantamount to torture, even if they were not on US soil. So SECOT is essentially an act of US torture subsidized by US dollars, by US tax dollars, and so on. So, and their being put on that plane was an act of an enforced disappearance, which violates another US treaty, and so on and so forth. So human rights standards become part of US law, and we can seek to enforce them in US courts, or until that happens, before tribunals of conscience. And that's why we're asking you to join us through the Tribunal of Conscience of Peoples and Movement at the US border, September 18th through 20th in Ciudad Juarez in El Paso, at hearings to hold US authorities responsible, for example, for those acts of torture at SECOT and similar acts and similar cases where migrants have died in U.S. custody because of U.S. authorities and their mistreatment, and in Mexico City on October 14th, 15th, and 16th coming up this year.
Thank you, Camilo. And what's so interesting in terms of what you say and how the current regime responds to its responsibility around human rights. We saw that firsthand last week when the U.S. issued a statement regarding the International Migration Review Forum, in which member states at the UN gathered to discuss how they develop policies, how they respond to the needs of migrants. And for the most part, this declaration that the United States issued was filled with a lot of accusations fueled by conspiracy theories. It's an interesting document that could be teased out and examined. And having had the opportunity of being there at the UN and listening to the conversations and interventions, it doesn't bode well for protections of migrants around the world. Marla,
Two last examples,
yeah.
Pedro, just really quickly.
Yes, please.
The extrajudicial executions, which is what they were, on the streets of Minneapolis by what was essentially a government death squad, ICE and Border Patrol, of Renee Nicole Wood and Alex Preddy, and on the streets of Chicago of Silverio Villegas. Those are also cases that will be brought before the Tribunal of Conscience and that fit into the same categories of international human rights crimes committed by U.S. agents.
That's great, especially because we should never forget their names. We should never forget who they were as people, members of our communities.
Exactly.
So thank you. Marla, I want to continue. Something that you referenced earlier were the parallels. And in this case, as a historian, I want to ask you about the parallels that you can point to in narratives of today's enforcement landscape and with what you've researched from the time of the Repatriation Acts. For instance, is there a subtext in Trump's quote unquote "Make America Great Again" that ties today's enforcement actions to a problematic past?
Yeah, thank you for posing that important question, Pedro. I always remind students when I'm teaching in the classroom that the present doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? That we're here because of actions of the past or past historical moments. And so we got to this current moment through replications and recycling of past injustices committed against different ethnic and racial immigrant groups and mixed status families, as Camilo and Tad powerfully provided examples for. The attacks on Chinese and Chinese American families, the attacks on Japanese American families, Filipino American families. It's a continuation of what we're seeing today. And of course, the attacks on Mexican and Mexican Americans during the interwar period, right? And now we see that expanded not towards a specific ethnic or racial group, but towards all immigrants of color, right? Or suspected immigrants of color, regardless of the legal status. And so the rhetoric that we use to excuse these injustices are also recycled, right? And so during the interwar period, we heard the scores by politicians and media and the general public social workers was that mixed status Mexican families were draining social services and taking away urgently needed jobs from quote unquote deserving Americans. The subtext of that was white Americans, right? So at that period, also, it's important to remember that between 1921 to 1944, the United States is undergoing a period of a strong economic stability during the 1920s, then a recession after World War I, the Great Depression, and then coming out of World War II as an emerging world power. And during that interwar period, 1921 to 1944, the United States, through those economic imbalances, is also reinventing themselves racially speaking, right? Is rethinking itself as a nation that is a white settled nation. And in order to center whiteness, you need to decenter people of color. And one way to do that was through mass removals, right? That we saw targeting Asians and targeting Mexicans. And another way is sterilizations, that we saw that an increase of sterilization against women of color and working class women of all ethnic and racial backgrounds, and some men as well, to prevent the reproduction of US citizens who were non-white, who could have political power and political voice in this country. So to center a nation that is a white cellular nation, you need to erase people of color through violent ways. It has been done through violent ways in the past. So when I hear the phrase "Make America Great Again," the question that I want to remind us of is great for who and for what end, right? And so we need to look at how the nation was constructed through racial and class lenses to understand how we want to reestablish ourselves and how we're going to construct our future as a nation. Do we want an inclusive nation, or do we want one that erases people based on class status, based on gender, based on race? And I hope that we can understand or center the need to move towards a more just and inclusive future, so that when we think about making America great again, we think about making America great for everybody that is in the United States, not for the few.
Thank you so much, Marla. Such insightful points about narratives. And I think it ties to the question I'm going to ask you now, Camilo, in terms of, we know that the administration has been making threats not only to migrants, but also to people with whom it might disagree with. Is the wholesale targeting of migrants a foretelling of a broader targeting of people who disagree ideologically with it? And how can we best prepare to protect ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's a crucial question. And I think it's certainly the way in which we felt and responded, through Witness at the Border, when we heard the terrible news of what we could only understand and interpret as these public executions, targeted executions in Minneapolis of Renee Good and of Alex Preddy. In part because we had a very active, contingent of Witness at the Border on the ground in Minneapolis. Our dear compañera Rosie Vaughan and others at St. Joan of Arc Church, and many mobilized observers on the street there. And what we immediately sensed was that there was this targeting of the task and the response of civilian observers themselves. And that throughout the country, in fact, what had emerged was this extraordinary tejido, as we say in Spanish. I don't think weave in English is a strong enough word, of these neighborhood groups that, we had whistles, they had guns, as Renee Good's wife said in her statement. In my own neighborhood at that time, I was living in Oakland in a primarily Guatemalan Mayan neighborhood where, there was this literal block by block network of rapid response that was activated whenever there was any hint of a presence that was invasive and that was potentially dangerous in our neighborhood. And at my daughter's community center where she worked in the Mission, the Instituto Familiar de la Raza, and at my daughter-in-law's school, and on and on. I mean, I can give you so many examples, but the important thing is that it was from the ground up. It was autogestión, it was autónomo, it was autonomous and self-organized. And this is throughout the country and throughout communities of all colors and varieties throughout the country. And this is something that, of course, builds on traditions of struggle that are very strong, that have all kinds of different varieties and definitions. But the important thing is that they are very also resistant to forms of repression. And so I think that doesn't mean that they're invulnerable, but they're also very resilient. And I've participated, I think many of us on this call have participated in the kinds of training and preparation that are needed to make these kinds of responses possible and to create these kinds of resilience. And I think that that's our strength. That doesn't mean that we're, again, impervious or invulnerable, but it does mean that we're much stronger than the enemy thinks we are, and that we can wait them out, and that we've been at this for 500 years or more in one form or another, and that much of this draws on indigenous traditions of struggle in the deepest sense of the word, and that's what inspires the Tribunal of Conscience. We draw on, I mean, our theme, our lema, as we say in Spanish, is todos los derechos para todas y todos sin fronteras. All rights for all without borders, because that is the ancestral tradition and affirmation of indigenous peoples long before these borders existed. And I think that's the driving theme that is pushing back, not just in LA and Minneapolis and Chicago, but on both sides of the border throughout the continent.
Thank you, Camilo. That's a great phrase to bear in mind as we continue to figure out, what the landscape, how the evolution of the landscape of enforcement keeps changing, and we know that with the billions of dollars, that evolution will continue to provide unfortunate opportunities. But if we ground ourselves, as you say, in our indigenous ancestral past, then we might have broader guidance for how we move forward. Marla, I want to ask you the next question. That we often hear the phrase, history repeats itself. What measures can we take now as civil society to ensure that we heed the lessons from the past era of questionable practices around immigration enforcement, so that those similar atrocities that we eschew are not committed again?
Definitely. And for that answer, I want to draw some excerpts from my book, Banished Citizens, and I'll show to center the voices of the women who I interviewed so that they can speak with us today through the text. And I'll show an image of Ramona Espinosa, who is the matriarch in the Espinosa family who was banished. And I interviewed 3 generations in each family in the book. And for the Espinosa family, it was Ramona Espinosa in the center, her daughter Guadalupe Espinosa, and the grandson, Arturo Espinosa. So let me then pull up the text here. One second. Okay. Banishment deprived a generation of Mexican Americans from securing opportunities and stability in their native country, the United States. Reflecting on her mother's life, Guadalupe Espinosa aptly concluded, quote, "My mother's generation is los hubiera, the would-haves. I think sí le desgraciaron la vida. They ruined her life. Because she survived in Mexicali, which is the place where she was banished to. But la vida no se trata de sobrevivir. Life is not about surviving." End quote. Banished people were left to fend for themselves, even when the US and Mexico had developed assistance programs for the needy. Guadalupe added, quote, "My mother would have gotten an education. One day, I took my mom to the neighborhood where she was born. And then my mom said, I would have gone to this school. she would have ended up at Garfield High School. She would have become a doctor because she really liked school. But my nana needed her to work, end quote. Banishment deferred the dreams of Mexican Americans who had to help their families survive in the wake of let me repeat that again. Banishment deferred the dreams of Mexican Americans who had to help their families survive in the wake of their displacement. As the Espinosa family's history demonstrates, during the greatest economic recession in recent history, both the US and Mexican governments disregarded the needs of banished people, even as they continue to benefit from the labor. Survivors and their descendants still feel the prolonged effects of banishment. Those consequences include economic and political disenfranchisement, but also emotional instability. As Guadalupe reflected by stating, quote, "They did this to my Nana Felicitas, the adults in the story. And the children, the American-born children with American constitutional rights, suffer all of the deprivations. But their children and their grandchildren, we are also afectados, or survivors. It's a cascading effect. It's still here, this wound," end quote. In the effort to survive amid extreme poverty, banished families traded emotional stability for economic stability. As a result, multiple subsequent generations now bear the prolonged emotional consequences of the wounds of banishment. These effects expanded to the political and economic realms as well. Ramona, Guadalupe's mother, explained, quote, "They sent children out even when they were born here. So there are no votes representing us. When we returned to the United States, my husband and I had to start from zero, even though we were born here. There is no progress. The new generation cannot progress," end quote. Ramona's observation about their inability to progress underscores the ways in which banishment hunted Mexican families across several generations. Even when banished Mexican Americans like Ramona and her husband Arturo defied their displacement by resettling back into their native country, the United States, the conditions had already been set for their economic and social stagnation. Banished Mexican Americans, their children, and their grandchildren are still enduring the emotional effects of banishment, as well as its prolonged consequences of political, economic, and ethnic disempowerment. But in breaking their silence and sharing their stories, Ramona and other banished survivors challenged their imposed illegality by demanding redress, and they have been successful at that. As a side note, many of these families, including the Espinosa family, were involved in holding state and local officials accountable for the state of California's role in the displacement of Mexicans and Mexican Americans during this period. And California is the only state in the United States who formally apologized for removing Mexican Americans during the 1930s specifically. And in 2012, the state unveiled a commemorative plaque so that people would remember this history. And this plaque is permanently installed outside La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, adjacent to La Placita Olvera, where one of the now infamous immigration raids took place that removed thousands of people from that region. So to close, let the acknowledgement of this history, which was so important to the families in this book, and so many banished women and children like them, not remain a symbolic act of the past, but serve as a reminder to enforce the civil and human rights of immigrants and US citizens in mixed status families today and into the future. In short, we need to understand the past to navigate the present more effectively. In doing so, we need to ensure we protect migrants and racialized US citizens' human, civil, and due process rights, and more urgently today than ever.
Absolutely, Marla. I think that's a powerful message about the protection of rights, especially as we consider how These wounds are generational and they transcend generation, especially as you mentioned in the children who are impacted by these terrible policies. Todd, I want to finalize the last question to you, which is something related to a more contemporary framework for immigration enforcement policies, which is deterrence, right? When Border Patrol developed their policy in the mid 90s, prevention through deterrence, which continues to be one of the major strategy frameworks for how the United States developed its immigration and border policies. Are there alternatives you would recommend that center human needs, and is it possible to pursue those today?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, the what Marla just towards the end just laid out, that was definitely um uh definitely I would think of that immediately. I look forward to reading your book, by the way. And I mean, one thing I think of, when you think of deterrence, the prevention through deterrence, and the word security, border security in particular, and how that word is bandied about and repeated endlessly, and it's sort of mind-numbing, and it seems mind-numbing in Washington, and people just nod their heads to it, and like, who can be against border security? One of the things that I think I've been thinking for a while that is that it would be great to just have a real honest conversation about security and what security really is and what it means. And that what if we were to have that conversation and look at human security, which I would define more along the lines of for the well-being of people, of all people, right? Well-being of all people, doesn't matter what side of a border you're on, what the well-being of everybody. The Sin Fronteras, as Camilo just, mentioned earlier, the without borders, right? And look at this kind of holistic thing, and then take the budgets. Look at the budgets. Look at this. Look at all the budgets that are going funneling into the system, the prevention through deterrence system, which is all about, if you think of the word security, is there anything about security that has to do with prevention through deterrence? It's about making people suffer as much as they possibly can crossing the border. It's about, you know, possibly killing people crossing the border. There's nothing security about that. For people who live in the borderlands and all the human rights violations we've detailed in our conversation today, there's no security with that, right? So what like if we were to look at the budget, say that $191 billion for the One Beautiful Bill Act, or the whatever, the $33 billion of CBP and ICE, that was last year's budget for the Trump administration. What is there ways that money could be spent on something else, right? That would be that would more follow in the definition of what real security is like the well-being, humanity's well-being, right? And then if we were to take that and have a conversation like we're having today with a more grand variety of people, like all these great people here, Pedro, Camilo, Marla, and then everyone here, and everyone, the Tribuno del Pueblo, everyone in the chat, and think of like, I'm sure everyone would have a better idea of how to improve the world than putting more money into CBP and ICE, right? Like the varieties in other words, like why not? And I mean, anything you can, if you took the money and then said, oh, you could put it like, what would be secure for people? Oh, a roof over somebody's head. Well, put the money into housing, take it away from CBP and ICE, and there's two problems solved at the same time. Or if you're thinking about climate, right, a climate change, an issue that's just not really addressed, definitely not addressed by the United States. What if you're to put some money into mitigation, or just a variety of different things? But the whole exercise, by doing such an exercise, yeah, I mean, I realize how reductive it is to think that this border, the way the border and enforcement apparatus that we have now is the quote unquote only way, right, that it's often presented as. And there are so many different possible ways, so many different ways we can look at, so many different ways where we can respect and address the rights of all people. That where do we begin? And one of those places and is just to have those sort of honest conversations that we don't have, that I should say we're having it right now, but the US doesn't really have that in a kind of bigger national way. It would be great for us to have that.
Great, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Todd, Camilo, and Marla for your responses. Very critical and nuanced responses to the questions. We have only a few minutes for Q&A, so we might not be able to answer all of the questions that are being posed. So I'm going to ask my colleague Joseph. Joseph, if you want to pick one question to begin with, and we'll see where we take it from there. Because I also want to give our panelists a minute or two at the end to give closing thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. The first question posed in the chat was from Isabel K, who asked, what has been the single thread of power that has kept the U.S. administrations since the 1930s focused on wars of aggression in partnership with corporations, particularly oil companies?
If any of our panelists would like to take that question on.
I think just a really quick thing to say, and I think a lot of us have alluded to it, is that immigration and border policy has always been the flip side of U.S. imperialism. Bottom line, it's always been both the product and the complement, and that's happening as we speak. I mean, everything I think that Todd was alluding to about current U.S. threats, whether it's against Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, concretely, all of the ways right now in which Mexico is being targeted, not just by drug control policy, but also by so-called counterterrorism policy. And of course, just a few months ago, by national security policy. Never before had Mexico been front and center in all three: drug control, counterterrorism, and national security. Mexico's very high on the list for an imminent kind of intervention. And all of that is deeply entangled with Mexico's increasing cooperation as to migration. The way in which Mexico has become the key containment place for migration flows, for basically externalization, the way in which the US-Mexico border has moved all the way to Mexico's border with Guatemala and successively all the way down to the Darien Gap. Talk about externalization. That's what's happening on the ground. So again, you can't separate US imperialism from border imperialism and externalization, and that's been the story since the 1980s. Bottom line.
Great, thank you, Camilo. Todd, Marla, would you like to answer, or should we move on to another question?
I can answer via, or can offer some comments via another question in the chat that asked about AI. And so the question was how, let me open up that question here. Could you ask the panelists to talk about AI specifically? What is AI doing presently, and where is AI headed in terms of immigration surveillance and persecution? And I think that's an important question to think about, especially as we see these rapid changes in technology and how they're being applied on the ground. In campuses across the United States, including my campus here, UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison, there's been installation of what are called FLAC cameras that use, a sort of artificial intelligence where they have facial recognition, or they also read license plates, right? And they're located on campuses, so that means anybody walking through a campus can be detected. And then the way that we are being told that these cameras are being used and enforced is for our protection, right? That it detects crime, it detects illegal activity on campus grounds, but they are owned, and the data is owned by third-party companies, right? So everything that is recorded then goes outside of the control of our campus and then into third-party companies, and we don't have little knowledge about how data might be used. So the conversations that we're having here at UW-Madison is asking our leadership and police department here to tell us more information about how this data can be used, because now people are afraid of coming to protest on campus or enforcing freedom of speech on campus for fear of being recorded and the repercussions that that recording might have if this data is stored by third-party companies that might have a specific political agendas, right? And so I think that conversation that we're having across college campuses needs to happen across pro-immigration rights groups and human rights groups, right? Because this technology will continue to enforce and center itself. We have now technologies like the smart glasses that also record people. We have phones, obviously. And so as these new AI technologies coming into place, we buy into this technology for the fun of it because there's advantages of this technology, obviously, right? But then the less known side or the more worrisome side for me is how it might affect the most vulnerable communities in our country. If now we have their faces and if the face recognition can be stored and tracked to people's legal statuses. There's been a case in Texas of a woman who had an abortion, and because abortion is illegalized in Texas, flag cameras were used to track her and then bring her into prison because she violated the state law, right? So we have precedent of how this technology might be used to persecute people, right? I think this is part of the conversation that we need to continue having, as Camilo was saying in the previous answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marla. And as people are noting in the chat, there are struggles and fights against Flock and other types of surveillance technology companies. And I know Todd has done a lot of work on that. And we all have stories. And I think that on its own, that topic of surveillance technologies in terms of enforcement can be its own panel, its own webinar, because it's so expansive and it's a new frontier of enforcement in ways that we can't get a grasp around. And I want to stop here. I know we're at time, so I just want to thank everyone. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I do want to ask our panelists to offer a final thought around documentation. All of you document in your own ways. Todd as a journalist, Camilo as a human rights scholar, Marla as a historian, and I just want to ask you 1 minute or less what the importance is of documentation in your work and of holding accountable the agencies that are so violently and flagrantly violating our rights. Begin with you, Camilo, since you have the mic open.
Thanks. I'd say this: join us to make this participatory in El Paso, Ciudad Juárez, September 18th to 20th, to help us document the human rights violations of U.S. authorities under the Trump administration, September 18th to 20th, and in Mexico City, October 14th, 15th, 16th, to make history in documenting the human rights violations of the Trump regime. Hold Trump accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilo. Todd, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I do think that documentation is huge. Camilo, I hope to make it to those events, or at least one of them. Of course, the work we do at the Border Chronicle, we put out 3 pieces a week, trying to follow what's going on the border. We've been at it since 2021, and following the last year and a half has been quite the task, and so please come and subscribe or support it in some sort of way. That's sort of documentation and cover. We're a small group of reporters, but we're trying to expand and bring the reporting more fully across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and beyond. So yeah, so that's that sort of documentation we do. We are trying to keep the leaders accountable and be transformative too.
Thank you, Todd. And Marla, I'll pass on so you have the last word on this subject.
Yeah, as a historian, I document through writing, and when the archive is silent on histories of marginalized communities, then I relied on oral history interviews. And now I'm collaborating with a bookstore and human rights organization in Southern California to continue documenting the untold, unrecorded experiences of banished Mexican and Mexican Americans during the 1920s and 1930s. Many people in the chat, and I know Pedro also mentioned in the beginning, that they come from families who experienced displacement and unjust removal during this period. And so if you're interested in having your or your family's history recorded, please send me an email to ramireztawa@wis.edu. I put that in the chat. I'll put it again because it is important to remember the injustices of the past, not because we hate our country, as sometimes we hear under this government, but because it's only through remembering the injustices that we can create more just and inclusive presents and futures.
Thank you so much, Marla. Thank you, Camilo. Thank you, Todd. And I want to also appreciate Tribuno del Pueblo, the People's Tribune, and everyone with Zooming to the Resistance, our wonderful interpreters for supporting us today, and all of you who joined us this evening. This webinar was recorded. It will be available online at some point in the future, and hopefully it'll be shared out to folks that signed in but weren't able to make it. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to be with you.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you.
Abrazos.
Gracias.
Thank you all.
The panelists, before you disconnect, and